Hello, this is the video lecture on pricing considerations and approaches. It goes along with the material in chapter 10 of the textbook and module 9 of the course. Um, Essentially, we're going through the marketing mix in more depth now. Pricing, well, there are many issues. First off, when choosing a price, you also have to think about what are your objectives? What are you trying to do? In terms of profit, in terms of sales, market share, um, competition. What you have to, your price will have a relationship to your competitors' prices. Um, what are you trying to achieve in terms of customer satisfaction? Um, Image enhancement. We know certainly that the higher the price, the higher the perception of quality is. Um, or are we simply trying to clear out inventory? Obviously, we would drop the price for that. So these are some considerations. We also need to look at demand. What is the nature and shifts in demand? Certainly, we know that demand for certain products shift seasonally. Uh, Certainly, we have seen how the demand for certain products have shifted during the pandemic. This was being recorded in the end of June of 2020. We're still in the pandemic, and certainly we've seen the shift in demand for certain products like masks and PPE, personal protection equipment. We've seen a drop in demand for other products. So that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. Also, price elasticity, and we'll talk more about that in depth. How is the demand affected by the price? Um, and in some cases, demand is elastic. In some cases, it's inelastic. And we'll get into more details about that. Some other pricing issues obviously are related to costs. Um, there are variable costs as well as fixed costs. The variable are the costs related to the amount of production that you undertake. Fixed costs are unrelated to production costs. Not completely, but they're not as affected by uh, production as other costs. So we'll get into that more specifically, and we'll do essentially a break-even analysis. We want to figure out at what point will we break even at a certain price level. And markups and margins. Many products we have to, when we price them, they're going to be sold by retailers or other resellers. They need to make a profit, and so we have to calculate what markup they will need, how much they'll need to raise the price, to make their profit, and our own personal margins for our product. Also, the price environment. What is the economy like? Again, competition. Also, government regulation. In general, the United States government tends to try to stay away from regulating prices. There have been some exceptions. In other countries, they may not be quite so restrained. So do that. Also, what are the customer trends to be considered? As well as the international environment. And I think we've spoken previously about exchange rates, also price expectations in other countries, and so forth. Price or the revenue is the product of the quantity sold times the price that it's sold at. And here we have to look at something called the demand curve. The demand curve defines the relationship between the quantity demanded and the price. The price is the independent variable, and the quantity sold is the dependent variable. Now we can set our product price higher, and therefore our margins will be higher, and that's a great thing. However, not many people will necessarily buy it. For instance, if I were to try to sell you your favorite beverage, let's say this was your favorite beverage, and I'm selling it for $5 a bottle, not that many people are going to buy it. However, as I drop the price, $4, $3, more people will buy it. And then, probably around $2 or so, we'll see an increase in the number of people willing to buy the product. Now, an alternative is that we can price ourselves very low, and that will create a lot of demand for our product, usually. But we're not going to make as much per unit, not as much profit. But if you look at these, two rectangles, the previous one, the previous one and this one, let's say they're roughly the same area or the same amount of revenue. So that's an important consideration. We probably want to find the perfect price. Now, this square also represents revenue, and if we could do this geometrically, a square would give us the maximum amount of revenue. Unfortunately, we can't calculate a square because price and quantity are two different units, so they're not really related. If we were using inches for both axes or the same unit, that would be fine, but we can't actually calculate a square here. But theoretically, conceptually anyway, we would like a square. We'd like to get pick a price that would give us the maximum amount of revenue. And we would have to do that through a process of changing the price and seeing the reaction to the quantity. And this can be done through something called regression analysis, which is a sort of a complex statistical model. I mean, you could just simply put the price up and down a little bit and just see what the reaction is on a simplistic level, but that's not always so easy. So regression analysis is a statistical tool you can use, and and I would encourage you to take a course in statistics. It's a very useful field. All right, what we try to do in marketing is to actually take this demand curve and push it out. We'll advertise more. We will try to do all sorts of things to increase demand. And let's say, and sometimes demand will jump up on its own because of some environmental factor, such as, again, the pandemic and masks. The demand for masks jumped up incredibly because of the pandemic. But there are lots of other situations where the demand for a product might increase. So at this point, we have some choices. We can simply sell more at the current level, and that's perfectly fine. That's great. However, an alternative is to actually increase the price in response to that increased demand, and we might get the same amount of revenue. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, we get the same amount of revenue. So I want you to think for a moment which you would actually prefer if you are the seller. And if you think about it for a while, most of you will come up with the conclusion that you would rather sell at a higher price, because the cost of producing the good or the product would be the same. So your margins essentially are going to go up. Now, you may not be able to do that for various reasons. You might be accused of price gouging. Certainly, if like in the case of the masks and the pandemic, if the cost of masks went up, let's say it's normally $2 and now you're being charged $10, you would be accused of price gouging, and there are some legal ramifications for that. But for instance, if you give you a different scenario, let's say you are an impresario. You set up concerts, and you've booked a concert for next fall. You've booked the musical act, the band. You've booked the arena. But in the intervening time, this musical group has a hit or a couple hits. It becomes very popular. And so there's going to be an increased demand for tickets to their concerts. Now, that's great for you. Can you take advantage of that? Well, you could raise the price, and that's perfectly acceptable, in at least in most cases. But you can't really sell more tickets than the arena can accommodate. You can't really, most arenas, you can't add more chairs. That would be seats. That would be rather difficult. If you have a limited supply, your only option would be to increase the price. And there have been cases where that has happened. I actually had a client. They made a product, and their manufacturing plant was going to shut down for 6 weeks. This was a planned event. It was for maintenance. So what they had done is they had overproduced the product to cover that 6-week period. However, during that 6-week period, there was some contamination in the production line, and as a result, their 6-week downtime turned into 3 months. And we were about to offer doing a promotion for the product because we knew that they had enough previous, that was all set. And then we heard about this contamination thing, and the product director and I we called each other. We had the same idea. We have to stop the promotion. We're actually going to drop the price a little to increase sales. And so we actually did the opposite. We increased the product because we knew now there was going to be a shortage. We then dropped the price on another product, an alternative, a substitute product, to sort of manipulate demand, push demand towards a product of which the company had more of it. And the product that they now had a slight shortage of, we actually raised the price on, because that was an opportunity, but also we did create an opportunity for the customers to go to a different product within the product line. Of course, obviously, you can split the difference. That's certainly a possibility, but something to think about in terms of thinking about price. Price can be, you can of course keep it static, but you can of course raise and lower the price occasionally based on the demand. Most products, as we've just seen, have a negative slope demand curve. Okay, like when we've just seen various opportunities at various, what will happen at various price levels. However, there are certain types of products that have a different type of demand curve, the prestige products. And here you actually see a curve that is counterintuitive, and you have various price levels. And if you think about this, certain prestige products, if the price drops, the perception of the product will also drop. For instance, if I offer to sell you a brand new Mercedes automobile for $5,000, you might wonder what's wrong with it. Why it just doesn't make any sense. Price is a signal of quality, as we've mentioned before. So most demand curves are the kind you see on the left side of the screen, the normal negative slope demand curve. However, sometimes for certain prestige or luxury products, you will see a different type of demand curve. So I talked previously about cost a little bit, and sometimes you need to do something called a break-even analysis. So let's take a look at a couple of these things. First, we have fixed costs, and fixed costs are costs which occur in the course of doing business, yet are not related to production. They might be things like rent or utilities, or paying personnel who are not connected with production. Let's say like a receptionist or some other staff positions. And in every financial period, whether it's a month or a quarter, whatever you're looking at, these costs will repeat, and they'll be the same. They're not related to how much you produce. Then we lay on top of those fixed costs are variable costs. And these are directly connected to the production of the product that you're going to sell. So let's say, as an example, we're in the shoe business, so we're going to manufacture shoes. So on top of these fixed costs, we're going to, these might be things like the cost of the leather, the laces, the soles and heels, and the labor to assemble them. And so as if we produce zero, we're going to have zero variable costs. But as we produce more, the costs will increase, which makes sense. And this is laid on top of the fixed costs. Now, if we look at revenue, and that would be according to our price, obviously it needs to be at a higher rate than our variable costs. There's no such thing as fixed revenue. So we essentially start here at zero. And eventually we'll get to a point where we cross the fixed plus variable cost line. And that is what we call the break-even point. Obviously, you need to break even before the financial period is over, because remember, those fixed costs reoccur again. So let's say we're talking about a month. So I need to reach that break-even point before the end of the month. Of course, hopefully I will go beyond that, beyond the break-even point, because I do want to make a profit. And so let's say this line represents, how many I've sold, so that will determine how much profit I make. Okay, great. How do we calculate our break-even point? Well, there is a formula. It is the fixed costs divided by the difference between the unit price that you're charging and the variable cost as for production. And this creates a break-even volume. So our costs and our prices are going to be in dollar figures, and in algebra, you're familiar with the concept of canceling out. The dollars will actually cancel out. And so we'll get a break-even volume. I've often asked students to run this calculation, and they give me an answer in dollars. It should not be in dollars. This is to determine how many units we have to sell to break even. So let's kind of run a test example here. Let's say our fixed costs are $500,000. Those are reoccurring costs that have nothing to do with production. And let's say we're going to charge $12 for every unit we produce, and our variable cost is $8. So the difference between 12 and 8 is 4. So 500,000 divided by $4 will equal 125,000 units. Okay, you can take a calculator or a pen and paper, or pencil and paper, and verify that. Okay, so we now know our break-even point is 125,000 units. Now that might be good, it might be bad, I don't know. But let's say somebody says, I really want to break even faster than that. What's the first thing what can we do about that? Well, the simplest thing to do is simply to raise the price. So let's just try raising the price by $1 and see what happens. So by raising the price $1, that increases the difference between the unit price and the variable cost, and that calculates to 100,000 units. Okay, that's better. We're breaking even sooner. Let's go a little bit further, add another $3 to the price. And so now that calculates to 62,500 units. Okay, that's actually half of the original break-even number. Okay, great. Why don't I just keep going? Well, obviously, I think most of you realize that there's a problem with continuing this process, because eventually you're going to bump up against that pesky demand curve. You keep on raising the price, fewer and fewer people will want to buy the product. So you have to be able to get to a break-even point, and hopefully the demand curve will not get in your way. Well, what if it does? What else can we do? Well, obviously there are two other elements in this calculation are fixed costs and their variable costs. And you will find companies working very hard to reduce those costs, particularly fixed costs, since they don't actually add anything to the production. In fact, that's why there's a lot of manufacturing outsourcing. That is simply a way to reduce fixed costs. Okay, so this is the calculation. It is something you might want to do if you're going to do large scale production, and there'll probably be some. Well, actually, I know there'll be some some homework on this coming up. Okay, another element I want to talk to you about is price elasticity. If you've noticed, when we talk about the demand curve, we actually just use a straight line, and it's simpler to do that. But however, they're not always a straight line. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'll get back to that. The demand is elasticity is the effect that price has on the quantity sold. Now, demand is said to be elastic if the price has a significant effect on the demand for the product or the quantity sold. And here we see we have a very shallow demand curve line. So if we change the price here from, let's say, this point to this point, it's actually going to have a more significant effect on the quantity demanded. However, demand is said to be inelastic if the price has little effect on the demand for the product. And here we see if you had the same price change, it would actually have less of an effect on the quantity sold. Okay, so the calculation for this is the percent change in the quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price, and that equals the price elasticity. So if we have a 10% change in price, and that generates a 15% change in the quantity demanded, that would calculate to 1.5, which is considered elastic demand. However, if that same change in price only produced a 5% change in demand, then price is said to be inelastic. Now, what sort of products tend to have inelastic demand? They are probably products that are highly sought, very necessary. Maybe not so much food, but certain medications. I do remember when my wife gave birth to our first child, she got a really bad infection, and the regular antibiotics just didn't work. So I ended up having to go to the drugstore and buy an antibiotic, that was prescribed, and it cost $1,000. But my wife had this, was sick, and I'm going to pay for it. In a similar way, if somebody found a cure for AIDS or some other disease, they could charge quite a lot for it, and people would pay it because they absolutely need it, and there's no alternative. So those sort of products would tend to be inelastic. And we have heard recently in the news, in the last couple of years, there have been a couple cases where a company decided to charge a really high amount for a particular medication, and people were very outraged, and it was in the news, and there's a lot of discussion like that. Other products that might be relatively inelastic in demand would be at the opposite end of the scale, luxury goods, which, does anyone here really worry about the price of luxury yachts, for instance? If somebody can pay $5 million for a yacht, they could probably pay $6 million. It's not really going to be that price sensitive. So the demand is going to be fairly inelastic. Other products where there are alternatives, there's lots of competition, there you're going to have very elastic demand. But the price elasticity can vary with the price level. It is not always a straight line. Sometimes it's a curved line, and that's why we call it the demand curve. At a certain point, uh, prices may go so high that it no longer affects the quantity. Um, an example from, I would say, over 10 years ago, the price of gasoline was going up, and it was fairly inelastic uh, because people still had to drive to work, people still had to get places, and the price was going up and up. And yes, everyone grumbled about the price of gasoline. And however, many economists have predicted by the time gasoline got to be $3 a gallon, then some elasticity would kick in, that people would try to consume less gasoline. That didn't occur. At least at the $3 level, when gasoline got to be the $4, at least in the state of New Jersey, that's when the demand started to be affected. And I know for myself, I started walking to the store as opposed to taking my car, or I'll take a bicycle. Or if I did drive, I would make sure I did a whole bunch of errands in one run. I wouldn't just, on an impulse, go out and drive to some place. I actually had a colleague teaching at a different school. He had a fairly long drive to campus, and he was offered a schedule where he only taught one class a day. And he actually told them unless they could put those classes on the same day, it wasn't worth it for him. And they wouldn't do that for him. So he actually said, no thanks, I'll find work elsewhere, because the cost of driving to campus and only teaching one class was just too much, and it affected him. It affected his job. So we will see that at certain points, elasticity will change. It's not always a straight line, as much as we like to portray it that way. Prices are also affected by the relative level of competition and along a competitive spectrum. And we're going to we're going to look at we're going to break this competitive spectrum into 4 categories. The first category is pure competition. Next is monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and pure monopoly. People often get pure monopoly and monopolistic competition mixed up. We must be distinct here, and we'll explain exactly what they are. Pure competition is where there are many sellers of a given product. In fact, the product is essentially a commodity, and by a commodity, what I mean is essentially there is no difference between my offering and your offering and anyone else's offering. You may be familiar with the commodity markets, and commodities would be things like gold and silver and crude oil, heavy crude, light crude, um, um, wheat, other types of grains, uh, and there's a whole bunch of other copper, things like that. If, let's say, we're dealing in gold, there's no real difference between my gold and your gold. As long as we meet the purity standard of, I think it's 0.999, we're good. I can't say my gold is better than yours, and you can't say yours is better than mine. So what will happen is pure supply and demand will come into effect. If the demand goes up, we both do better. If the demand goes down, we both do worse. This is called uniform market pricing. And we see, like gasoline, the gasoline prices generally go up and down together. There may be some regional variation, a geographic variation, but essentially, when the price of gasoline goes up, it goes up everywhere. In general, we would prefer not to have pure competition because we want to get more for our product. Some other products that are not pure commodities that I've just described, but other products that are maybe very, very similar to their competitors, can move into the pure competition category. So we try to differentiate our products as best we can. New technology or some other point of differentiation. And in monopolistic competition, there are also many sellers. However, our products are differentiated so we can charge different prices. If we can convince people our product is a little bit better, then we can get a higher price for it. Oligopoly is where there are fewer sellers. There are differentiated products. However, competitors' prices are sensitive to one another. The closer the competitor, the more sensitive they are. For instance, Coke and Pepsi, they are sort of the cola oligopoly. If the price of Coca-Cola goes up, the price of Pepsi can go up. If one goes down, the other will go down. It's kind of pure competition, but in a very narrow market demand, market category, product category. The last is pure monopoly, which is probably the most desirable if you have that one product. There's one seller. If you are the only provider of this product, you can charge quite a lot for your money. Now monopolies come in many types. Ones we tend to think of are ones like utilities, electric, water, gas, that sort of thing. Another one would be, well, for many years, De Beers operated as a monopoly. If you're familiar with De Beers, it's headquartered in South Africa. They had a monopoly. They were very tough competitors. Now, they didn't have all the diamonds in the world, but they had most. They mined most of the diamonds, and they could set whatever price they did and whatever the price they wanted. And when somebody else discovered some diamonds, they would often flood the market with diamonds to drive down the price. They actually affected the price of diamonds worldwide based on how much they were willing to supply. Another example of a pure monopoly would be any company that has a patent. For instance, let's say a pharmaceutical patent. They are the only ones allowed to sell that product. I mean, they can license it out, but that's not usually the case. It's only once they become or go off patent, then you can have generic drugs or generic products of any kind that have gone off patent, and that sort of moves over to the monopolistic competition at that point. The original manufacturer usually still has an advantage. For instance, Tylenol, which is not Tylenol, Advil, which is actually ibuprofen. There are generic ibuprofens, but Advil, because it is a trusted brand, still has an advantage, and they can differentiate there. Another example of a monopoly would have been, was Standard Oil. The government broke it up. There were no, because they had such a monopoly. We get into the area of antitrust law here. It's okay to be a monopoly, but once you're a monopoly, you have to be very careful to avoid predatory practices. I mentioned De Beers a moment ago. They often engage in predatory practices, so we want to be careful about that. And in many cases, the prices will be regulated, and there are often cases where governments will come in. A case where this occurred was with Microsoft. Microsoft had pretty much had a monopoly on operating systems. There were a few. I know some of you will say, well, what? But there's Apple. But at the time, Apple was on death's door. The company was not in good shape. I think the stock price went under $1 a share. In fact, and the Justice Department came in and said, you're a monopoly and you're engaging in predatory practices, and they were. They had actually undermined competitors, not for the operating system, but for their applications. And they gave the operating system code to their competitors who they had to, but they didn't give the full code. They gave it, like 96% of the code, not the entire code. And so their products work much better. For instance, you're all familiar with Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, but you wouldn't be familiar with WordPerfect, Lotus 1-2-3, or Harvard Graphics. These were the competitors, and they were actually created these products, and Microsoft just copied them. But because they had the advantage of also owning the playing field, the operating system, they had an advantage, and that was a predatory practice. And they also did a number of other things that were somewhat predatory. So the government was actually thinking about coming in and breaking them up in the same way they had broken up AT&T years ago. When I grew up, there was only one telephone company, AT&T. There was no competition. Once they broke AT&T up, I think they broke it up into 7 companies, and some of them since then have remerged. I think Verizon is actually 3 of those, what they call the baby bells, merged together. But that's when they started to innovate. They started to compete, and there are all sorts of innovations, cell phones and other things like that. So sometimes when you're in a monopoly, that's a great position economically and marketing-wise. It's great. However, you may get into some legal problems, so you have to be very careful. I do remember I did work for a company that had a monopoly on a particular pharmaceutical product, and we would occasionally have to meet with lawyers just to make sure that we weren't engaged in any predatory practices. So, okay, so looking at pure competition and monopolistic competition, oligopoly and pure monopoly, you have to figure out with your products, where do you fall? And that will affect your pricing decisions. When introducing new products, you'll have various new product pricing strategies to choose from. The first is called market skimming pricing. And if you think about the demand curve, you have lots of choices. And what market skimming pricing is doing is setting a high price for new products to skim the maximum revenues layer by layer from the different segments willing to pay a higher price. Good example of this was the first iPhone. They understood there was a demand curve, but they set the original iPhone, I believe they charged $600. So that shows a very high price for cell phones. I think it was the first smartphone, but people didn't really understand what smartphones were. But Apple had a lot of devoted customers. It's a very strong brand. And people lined up. I remember people lining up for the iPhone, and there'd never been this sort of product before. And they paid $600 for it. Great. After sales started to drop off because they had pretty much gotten all the innovators and early adopters, they then dropped the price, and they picked up some additional sales. And this was people who this included people who would not pay $600, but they would pay $400. Probably a combination of early adopters and the early majority. And then they dropped their price, several months later to $200, which actually really aggravated the people who had paid $400. This because it was such a high visibility product. Their pricing strategy was very apparent to the customers, and a lot of people who paid $400 screamed and yelled. And so what Apple did was they said, okay, if you bought an iPhone for $400 in the last 2 weeks, we'll give you a rebate, a $200 rebate, which really annoyed the people who bought 3 weeks before, but you have to draw a line somewhere. And a lot of products will do this. When they come out at first, they'll come out at a really high price, and then drop to skim off the people who are willing to pay for it, and then lower their price and pick up new customers, the more price sensitive customers. There is market penetration pricing, where you set a low price for a new product in order to attract a large number of buyers and create a large market share. Microsoft did this when they introduced Windows. In fact, I think initially they gave it away because people weren't really aware of what an operating system was. Um, and they still don't charge a huge amount for their operating system because it provides other advantages to them. But they wanted to have everyone using the Windows operating system. So, and if it helps to your profits to have a large market share, then that's maybe what you'll do. Another alternative is sort of it's kind of a variation of market penetration pricing, to have a trial pricing. This is to get trial, and so you have a lower price for a limited time. It's sort of an initial offer. And a lot of people will do this. I do remember, I think I mentioned, I work in a product that was a monopoly, and it had been that way for many years. We finally got a competitor, and we were expecting them to price themselves lower than us. And what they did was they priced themselves higher than us, but then gave a lot of discounts and rebates. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to show that they were better by having a higher price, but then offer discounts and rebates to do that. So that's the way it is. Some other pricing tactics include two-part pricing, and this is where you don't pay for everything at once. An example of this might be being a member of a country club with a golf course. So you might pay the membership fee up front, and then whenever you go to play golf, you pay a greens fee. So, it doesn't seem you're not paying it all at once. I mean, you could certainly incorporate all the greens fees into the upfront membership fee, but this keeps the membership fee a little lower if that's what they're looking for, and also people are paying for more usage, so it makes sense. And in many ways, you might have two-part pricing. For instance, I proctor something called the GARP exam twice a year. It's the Global Association of Risk Professionals. That's not important. What it is to be part of this program. This is a certification exam. To be a part of the program, I think they have to pay, and I may not have the exact numbers correct. I think they have to pay $400 to be a part of the program. And then for each certification exam they take, they have to pay another $350. So that's another example of two-part pricing. So payment pricing, where you're spreading the cost across multiple payments. It doesn't seem so bad when it's in smaller amounts. So for instance, my son bought an iPhone, but he bought it through his, I think it was Verizon program, and he essentially didn't pay it up front. He paid, $50 a month. So I guess for a year then. So that's another strategy. So, he might have been a little reluctant to buy it up, pay the $600 up front, but if you spread it across a time period, it's not so bad. So that's a good way to induce sales as well. Product bundle pricing, which I believe I had mentioned earlier in the semester, where you take a sort of a basket or a batch of products and bundle them together. Probably one you might be familiar with would be a value meal or some sort of the meal at a McDonald's. The sandwich, the French fries, the beverage, and you get it at a lower price if you buy the entire meal. Like for instance, I would usually just buy the sandwich and the beverage, but for another 50 cents, I can get the French fries, which might ordinarily. Oh, I seem to have lost. I'm sorry. I seem to have lost my camera here. Okay, I think I got that fixed. All right. Product bundle pricing is where we take a bunch of products and bundle them together. And I think I gave the example of a sandwich at McDonald's, the value meal sandwich, beverage, and the French fries. And for maybe 50 cents, I might just buy the sandwich and the beverage, but for 50 cents more, they'll give me the French fries. And so they're inducing me with a bundle as opposed to that. Now, I think I may have mentioned this previously. Forcing bundling is illegal for products that are available separately. And I think I gave an example when I went to buy a video camera. I found a good price. I called someone up to order it, and they asked me what bundle I wanted. And I told them I didn't want a bundle. I wanted just the camera. And they said, well, we only offer it as the bundle. And I asked them what was in the bundle, and it was all crap stuff, lens tissue, filters, a crappy tripod. I just didn't need that stuff. So I found out this company was pulling this, and they would just disappear and reincorporate themselves in the next state. And then, when they were found out, they would come back and reincorporate themselves at yet another company. Very unfortunate sort of practice. So it's a combination of products sold together. We also have captive product pricing, and these are products that need to be bought with another product you bought. For instance, if you buy a printer, maybe it's the ink cartridge or the toner cartridge. GE made a lot of money. They sell X-ray machines and other types of medical equipment. And they discovered they made a lot of money on the X-ray tubes, because X-ray tubes, like light bulbs, will burn out and need to be replaced. And they realized they could charge more, because if you have a $500,000 X-ray machine but no tube, that machine is worthless now. So they could realize they could make a lot of money that way on replacement parts. So the products, pricing products that must be used with the main product. We also have product line pricing, and this is setting price steps between product lines. For example, you look at General Motors. They have their Chevy line, their Buick line, and their Cadillac line. The Chevy line is the least expensive. The Cadillac line is the most expensive. So Chevy is for their people who are more price sensitive. And so they're the price levels between each of their lines. Option product pricing, and this is where you have pricing accessories that are sold with the main product. Slightly different from captive pricing. You don't really need these things, but it's a way to get add-on, upsell a little bit, get a little bit more. Byproduct pricing is where you have low value products that are going to be disposed of. And for instance, like paper plates and paper cups. One that used to be very popular was, let's say you go to a wedding and every table would have a disposable camera. And these were not high value cameras. They were made out of plastic and cardboard, but you could take pictures and then you would just give them to the bride and groom, and they would send them in for processing. The cameras themselves cost very little, and they were just to be disposed of. They were just sent recycled. And actually, I forget, one of the paper plate companies found if they made their paper plates too nice, people wouldn't dispose of them. The great thing about disposing of something is then they have to buy more. If they want to have it for their next party, you have to buy more paper plates. When one company made paper plates that were too nice, people washed them and kept them. So then we have loss leader pricing. Loss leader is a price that is a product that is sold at a price below its production cost. For example, I can go into any supermarket that anywhere, and I've never been there before, and I can tell you exactly where the milk is going to be. The milk is going to be at the far corner of the store, farthest way from the front door. If a gallon of milk, let's say a gallon of milk costs $4, And the net margin in most retail outlets are probably most retail operations, supermarkets and things like that, are 2 to 3%. So let's say you're making maybe 4%. So let's say on a $4 gallon of milk, their net margin is somewhere between 9 and 16 cents. And then somebody comes in with a 25-cent off coupon. Then they're losing money, even if they sell more. In fact, the more gallons they sell, the more money the store loses. Why would they do such a thing? Well, and some of you may have already picked up on this. Yeah, I have to go to get that gallon of milk, but I have to go through all those aisles, and I might pick up additional products, cookies and cereal or anything else that might, catch my eye. And so by coming in for the milk is leading me, even though it's taking a loss, it's leading me in to make other purchases. In a similar way, when Amazon first came out with the very first Kindle, it cost, I think, $115. It actually cost them $125 to manufacture. They were losing $10 on every Kindle. But that was okay, because why would you buy a Kindle? You buy it to download the books, and that's where they made their money, in downloading the books into the Kindle. So, and this is called a loss leader. So some products, so you have to have other products that you're going to make a profit on. And that's the purpose of loss leader. It's the lure to get you into the store, or to get you to buy that, which will one product that will encourage you to buy other products. And then we have allowance pricing. I don't know why this popped up at the top. Allowance pricing is where you drop the price a little bit more, not in exchange for money or something else. If you're buying something, they'll drop the price, and what you have to do is give them something. The most common one is trade-ins on a car. So let's say I'm going to go buy a car, and it's going to cost me $20,000, and they'll give me $500 off if I give them my old car. And a lot of people will do that just as a way of disposing of their old car. Not actually a great deal for the consumer. If you can sell your car, I mean, assuming it runs, you might get more for it than what they're going to give you. But it's a way of dropping the price of the car. I'll give you another example. I had to have my roof redone a few years ago, and I found a roofer who I was very happy with, and he said, "I will drop the price another $200 if you let me leave my sign on the roof. I mean, on your lawn." He said, "Well," I said, "Well, you mean while you're doing the job?" He said, "Oh, no, for 6 months." And I said, "No. I mean, I chose not to, but if I had taken the deal, it would have been essentially giving him advertising. I basically put an advertising sign on my lawn for 6 months, and that's what he was willing to pay, drop the price. So there is this allowance pricing that happens from time to time. Okay. There are some other issues. There is price fixing. These are ethical and legal issues. And price fixing is an antitrust violation. And what it is if you and your competitor agree to not go below a certain price, this, as I said, is an antitrust violation. We like competition. This is what free enterprise is all about. And we like it as a society, because the customer will get the best deal. However, if suppliers are colluding, agreeing to not drop their price below a certain point, that's going to be not good for consumers, not good for the economy in general. So price fixing is illegal. There is also bait and switch. Bait and switch is where somebody offers a product, maybe it's a very desirable product at a great price. And then when somebody goes into the store, it's, oh, I'm sorry, we're all out, they say, but we have this other product, we'd like to, just as good, that's called bait and switch. They're being baited to come in for one product and then switched over to another. Now, they may legitimately be out of the product they advertised, but it's certainly unethical. I mean, some people say, well, they do. Somebody once told me, well, we buy three units to say we've ordered it. And then when they sell out, then we do the bait and switch, which is obviously unethical. Predatory pricing is pricing below so far below a competitor, is designed to drive the competitor out of business. And obviously, honest price competition where you're working your way down, it's good for consumers. That's fine. Whoever can go lowest, I guess, wins. But certainly, if you have a monopoly, predatory pricing can be designed. If you're a monopoly, you're in a stronger position. And if you do get a competitor and you try to initiate predatory pricing, that could be a problem. It could be a legal problem. So you want to be very careful about that. Okay, we've come to the end. I strongly encourage you to read the chapter in the textbook and do any assignments in Module 9. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Take care.